Apple just released its public betas for iOS 13 and macOS Catalina, and maybe most importantly, iPadOS. And I say that knowing full well that it's basically just a tablet-tuned version of iOS 13. What's really interesting here is that Apple has kind of achieved two goals at the same time. They've preserved that classic iPad experience for people who just want to watch movies and browse the web, and that's gonna be fine. In fact, it's gonna be better in some ways, which we'll get to. But more importantly, for people who really want to try and use an iPad for work, like those pro users who might want to buy an iPad Pro, there are enough changes here that actually might make an iPad Pro a viable option. Let's take a closer look. First, I think we should really quickly run through the look and feel of iPadOS. All of the stuff that's in iOS 13 that made it such a sort of unique design experience is here too. You've got the dark mode, you've got the revamped volume HUD. It works just fine on these bigger screens too. What's really interesting is Apple sort of realized, you know what, there's always been a ton of dead space. Let's really kind of make use of that. So you can now squeeze up to 30 apps, not including apps in the dock, onto a single home screen. That's up from 20 in earlier versions of iOS. And to also really make use of that on-display space, Apple has also given you the ability to lock your Today widgets directly to the side of your home screen. That might not sound like a huge deal, but if you're like me and you like having quick access to breaking news and stock prices and your to-do list, which is more important to me than maybe anything else I've just mentioned, having them live directly on your home screen is kind of a game changer. This revamped design is maybe the least interesting of Apple's changes here. I personally find the tweaks Apple has made to multitasking much more valuable. Just like with earlier versions of iOS on iPads, you can multitask through two main tools, slide over and split view. The way slide over works is you drag an app from your dock over to the side of the screen, and that forces it to run in a narrow window that floats on top of another app. So if you're like me, you're probably watching YouTube and you want to look up some lyrics, you drag Safari over and get that nice floating window for really quick access to extra context. The big difference with iPadOS is you can now have multiple apps running in slide over. So if you need Slack and Gmail and Safari going, you can drag each of them into that floating window and swipe through them very quickly by kind of thumbing the bottom of the screen. In a way, Apple just kind of replicated the iPhone X's quick app switching functionality in slide over, and it's a lot more helpful than you'd think. I should also point out that if you swipe up from the bottom of that, you'll actually be able to see all of your sort of app slices in one place, so it's much easier to jump in and bring up whatever extra context you need by selecting that app. The second main tool for multitasking is split view, and it kind of works the same way mechanically, at least. You grab an app from the dock, you drag it over to one side of the screen, and it'll divide, so you have two apps running side by side. It's always worked pretty well if you needed slightly more detailed views of two apps at the same time, but what's really interesting about iPadOS is you can now drag elements from one app and into that secondary space. Effectively, you've got two windows running the same app. I know what some of you are thinking, what good is that? At this point, because third-party developers haven't really embraced it yet, you might not notice it, but it is genuinely helpful at times. If you're surfing the web in Safari, for example, and want to open up a new page without giving up what you're currently looking at, you can grab a link from Google search results over to the side of the screen, and it'll open in a secondary app window, no problem. It's one of those tweaks that I didn't think I would find particularly valuable going into it, but now that I've gotten used to it, I kind of can't give it up. That said, it isn't exactly perfect. When I hold an iPad with both hands and I'm just sort of scrolling through websites, I find it's easier than it should be to grab something by accident and open it up in a separate window, which immediately puts me in the mindset of, well, damn, how do I close this thing again? Apple could probably play with this timing a little and get it feeling a lot better, but the core functionality works, and frankly, I'm glad it's here. For me, though, some of the biggest successes in iPadOS are basically just ways Apple has coerced it into running a little bit more like a traditional computer. Take browsing in Safari, for example. Apple talked up, quote, desktop class browsing, unquote, in Safari at WWDC for quite a while, and with good reason. I've never been able to fully rely on Safari to give me exactly the version of a website I wanted. Sometimes I would get the full desktop view, which was great, that's what I need. Other times it would default to the mobile site, and you can sort of get it to show you a desktop version of the site, but that takes extra steps that shouldn't be required, honestly. That's not the case anymore. Every web page I've loaded on an iPad mini and a 12.9-inch iPad Pro running iPadOS correctly showed me the desktop version. Even better, all of the web apps that I use on a regular basis that I could never really count on using in Safari and iPads in the past actually work perfectly here. Google apps are probably the best example. We use Google Docs, we use Google Sheets, Gmail, all of that stuff plays a really important role in making sure stuff happens at Engadget. And I've been able to interface with every one of those services directly in Safari perfectly. It takes a little bit of getting used to because you're touching instead of clicking, and kind of getting used to that takes a bit of time, but I'm honestly surprised and thrilled that this works as well as it does. One of the other ways Apple has improved the iPad by making it act a little bit more like a regular computer is in the way that it handles files. If you're a longtime iPad user and you've used the Files app before, you'll know that you could look at stuff in folders on your device created by other apps and manage things fairly well in iCloud Drive as a whole, but you could never create your own folders on your iPad and put files on your iPad. That is no longer the case. I spent the last few days connecting USB thumb drives and creating folders in files on this iPad because it's got a terabyte of storage. I've got to use it somehow. And I've just been moving stuff back and forth, A, because I can, and B, because I would prefer having my stuff in multiple places just in case something happens. Your specific scenario might be a little bit different. And there's a pretty good chance that if you're watching this, you actually won't ever need to do this. It kind of runs counter to what Apple has trained us to believe the iPad should be able to do. That said, if you're a pro customer and want to be able to make full use of the storage that you paid for, this is a big deal. The only hiccup I've run into so far is that Apple says you can use USB thumb drives connected to an iPad Pro or USB hard drives, but the one USB hard drive I tried did not mount for whatever reason. It drew power from the iPad totally fine, it spun up the way it's supposed to, but just never showed up in files, and I'm still actually not sure what that's about. The list of new updates, frankly, goes on for a while. There are a lot of pencil improvements if you're an Apple Pencil person. Latency is said to have been reduced down to about 9 milliseconds, which, for those of you keeping count, that's just about half of the latency you'd see out of the original Apple Pencil, which sounds pretty impressive. I haven't noticed any really concrete changes, but if you're an artist, that'll probably come in handy as you're doodling on screen. I should also point out that the smallest change with the Apple Pencil is probably the most helpful. If you swipe in from the sides of the screen using the pencil, iPadOS will take a screenshot that you can immediately start marking up, which is really nice for quickly getting stuff out there and sending it to people who might need this information. There's also Sidecar, which allows you to use your iPad Pro either as a graphics tablet or a secondary display for a Mac when it's connected via USB-C. I will be perfectly honest, I did not have a spare Mac I could use to sacrifice to the public beta gods, but our colleague Dana Wollman does, and she has her full impressions in her macOS Catalina beta story on Engadget. So check that out if you want to know more. Oh, and just because I feel like I should point out, yes, you can use a mouse with iPadOS. Here's what you have to keep in mind. It's actually part of an accessibility feature called Assistive Touch. And iPadOS, even though it's been tweaked and tuned in a lot of very valuable ways, just doesn't actually handle mice all that well. I've tried it with a few Bluetooth mice. The pairing process was super simple once you found the right settings, and you can even customize the mice buttons if you've got a bunch of extras. But at least in my case, since there's no way to adjust the sensitivity of the mouse, the cursor just sort of bounced all over the screen, even while I was barely moving my hand. It's useful to an extent, but if you're counting on using this feature on the daily, just don't. Between the strong foundational changes that we're getting on iOS 13 and all of the very, very helpful iPad-specific tweaks that you'll find in iPadOS, I don't think there's ever been a better time to be an iPad person. It doesn't hurt that Google has officially bowed out of the tablet race, leaving Apple one of the only companies out there really devoting resources to making good tablets. Because iPadOS contains so many changes, from the very subtle to the sweeping in scope, there's a little something here for everybody. And for Apple, a company that has kind of been caught between different priorities when it comes to tablets, the ability to please kind of everybody in one shot is really important and something that I haven't seen in a while. This is a big update, and we're going to continue to dig into what it means right up until the official launch sometime this fall, so stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching.